October 15th, 2019 to order. May we have flag salute? I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
May we have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Danziger?
Here.
Commissioner Willis?
Here.
Commissioner Stroman?
Here.
Vice Chair Castellanos?
Here.
And Chair Sarkozy is absent excused.
I'd like to ask anybody that has a cell phone, pager, or similar device, please either set it on silence or vibrate unless you are an on-duty emergency responder. I'm going to turn mine off. Presentation. Consent calendar minutes. Any discussion, corrections? Anybody in favor?
I have comments, but I'm going to save them until the commission portion of the, because they don't affect the acceptance or anything of the minutes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I agree.
Could you
'Cause
some
I
feedback?
feel the same way.
I make a motion that we approve the minutes from the August 13th meeting.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Right.
Motion carried. Let's see, public hearing, none. Administrative matters. I guess we're here to hear, accept audience comments on the public review draft of the city's general plan housing element update.
Thank you, Vice Chair. I just wanted to reiterate that we had put out an email to the Planning Commission that we did open a 30-day public review. We did contact all of the local stakeholders regarding the housing element and advise them that tonight they could provide public comment to the Planning Commission in person or mail in, email any comments. We have not received any through mail or email, but obviously we have some people in the audience, and then Beth is also here with De Novo Planning to do a little presentation on where we're at with the housing element.
Would you like to
All right.
do your presentation?
Good evening, Chair and members of the Commission. I'm Beth Thompson with De Novo Planning Group, and our firm has been hired by the city to prepare a focused general plan update. So we're preparing the housing element update and then also an update to the safety element, and then a set of policies and actions related to environmental justice will be coming to you separately. And that doesn't go to the state for the 60-day review period that the housing element does, so it's a little more straightforward when you get that. So briefly, we'll just discuss why the general plan update is important, what the housing element is. We'll go through some of the key information included in the housing element, and then I'll hopefully get some great input from you and the public tonight. So the general plan provides the city with a statement of the community's vision. So it identifies what the city wants to see in terms of its land use, its plans for infrastructure, its plans for conservation, and its plans for providing public services. So it serves as a decision-making guide for the electeds and the appointed officials in the city. It also helps staff understand what the long-term goal is, and as staff is reviewing projects and making decisions, staff can go and consult the general plan and identify whether or not projects are consistent with the general plan. And it lets the community and developers and stakeholders know what the city's vision as well. So it's an important resource document that includes the long-term goals of the city and a statement of the vision, and most importantly, it's a land use document that identifies where and how things will happen. So the general plan has 8 required elements. Well, it has 7, and then in San Joaquin Valley, there's also the air quality element. So it's required to include the land use, circulation, open space, conservation, safety, air quality, noise, and housing elements. As part of this project, we're doing a full update to the housing element, and then we're also making select updates to the safety and conservation element, as well as I just mentioned, preparing a goal and policy set to address environmental justice. And when you get those updates, you'll also receive kind of like a mini background report. It won't be nearly like the housing element in terms of length, but just a background report that identifies the regulatory framework and the reasons behind the changes that are being proposed. Focusing on the housing element is a document that's required by state law, and it looks at a shorter planning period than the rest of the general plan. So usually a general plan is considered to be a 10, 20, 30-year vision document, and the housing element addresses an 8-year cycle, so it has a shorter time frame. It's a needed document to identify the city's policies and programs that reflect how the city will address its needs, how the city will meet its housing goals, and then also to address any current challenges and opportunities as well to provide housing. And in addition to that, it's also a requirement that the city have a certified housing element in order to be eligible for various state funding sources. So for a number of the HCD administered funding grants like the SB2 grant that the city will be receiving, I think that is a requirement that the city have a certified housing element and regularly be reporting on the housing element. So at the outset of the housing element update in the summer, we held 2 community workshops and had an online survey available. So we sought to get input from the community regarding what are the current housing needs in the city, what's the vision, and what are some constraints. So in terms of addressing the city's housing priorities and vision, we heard repeatedly that senior housing is a need in the city and that the community wants to see senior housing developed. We also heard that there was a need for additional senior and human services, addressing low to moderate needs for elderly people, addressing additional opportunities for regional dependable transportation, encouraging additional affordable housing, including single-family housing and housing for first-time homeowners, and then just continuing to plan for measured growth. The city's growth management ordinance is important to many of the city's residents, and making sure that the city just continues to manage its growth was something that we heard as well. In terms of some of the challenges, things that are a barrier or constraint to the city accommodating its housing needs that have been identified by the state, we heard that funding is a main challenge. There's not a lot of funding out there to assist with developing affordable housing or senior housing. There also are infrastructure needs that need to be addressed as development occurs, concerns regarding some limitations placed by the city, which we address in the housing element, the constraints to housing, both the price of land and then the lack of available land for development, and then also just the overall pricing of the housing market. So those were some of the constraints we heard regarding housing development. So going through the housing element, I'll just briefly go through each of the main sections of the housing element. It includes an evaluation of the city's accomplishments under the current adopted housing element, an update to the city's housing needs assessment, which is a demographic look at what's going on in the city, addressing the constraints to housing, identifying resources available for housing development, and then at the end, providing a housing plan that addresses all of the needs identified in the housing element document. So, looking at the city's accomplishments, since the housing element was adopted back in 2016, the city has made some progress towards its allocation of 425 units. And this is a state allocation, so the state allocates housing needs to the San Joaquin Council of Governments, which then allocates to each jurisdiction in the county its fair share of housing needs. And I have a slide a little later that gets into that. But in terms of addressing the city's housing needs, the city did identify adequate sites in the 2016 housing element, so there's ample land to accommodate the city's housing needs. 44 units were constructed during the period, including 7 moderate and 37 above moderate income units. And the moderate income units are market rate, so they're moderate just by virtue of the market rate pricing at the time they were constructed. And then there's 9 additional units that have been permitted, 1 moderate, which is an accessory dwelling unit, and 8 above moderate single-family units as well. And then there are also 9 additional units approved, and those are the Lear Village units, and those are anticipated to be affordable to moderate income households as well. And there might be 1 more unit in that count as well. In addition to progressing towards the city's allocation, the city conducted regular outreach to the development community and service providers. It holds an annual public hearing to receive input on the city's housing needs and community service needs through the CDBG and Home program. And the city also provided funding for housing rehabilitation services and fair housing services. And in addition, the city made a number of updates to the zoning code to remove the constraints that were identified in the 2016 housing element. So the city has definitely been working towards implementing its housing element.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
The allocation of 425 units, is there a time frame set with that allocation?
Yes, and I have a slide for that. So that goes through 2023,
Okay.
and then you'll receive a new allocation.
What happens if we don't meet the 425 in 2023?
So there's no penalty for not, at this point, there's no penalty for not developing the units. However, there are some new penalties since your last housing element was adopted. So one of the things you may have noticed was an SB 35 housing streamlining discussion in chapter 5, I believe. And that identifies if the city is not progressing towards its regional housing need allocation, the state now requires the city to implement ministerial approvals for certain housing projects. And so the penalty becomes, if you haven't progressed far enough, that you have to approve housing in a different manner. But there's no other penalties other than some changes to the zoning code.
The city doesn't have any way of forcing property owners to develop their property.
Right.
So without being able to do that, the city then becomes subject to state law in that they take out our way of making sure that we have a nice planned community and force it just to go over the counter, essentially.
Essentially, and there are certain standards and requirements that you can apply towards that type of development or towards that type of process, so you don't just have to let every project go through, but you have measured standards that you can apply to a project to make sure that it meets the city's requirements. It just happens at a ministerial level, meaning that it's a staff level approval, it's not subject to CEQA, and it's not a discretionary action.
And the 44 units was over what kind of time frame?
That is since 2014.
Okay, so at that pace, we'll be achieve the 425 units in about 50 years. So,
That's if we don't lift the moratorium on annexations and the existing property owners want to develop their property, maybe 50 years.
okay.
You have some larger sites that if a developer wants to develop them, you could get a chunk of units. But as you saw with the Countrywood development, that happened very slowly. Even though you had a large subdivision that was approved, it's taken quite a bit of time for that development to come to fruition. So you may see that pace even if you were to approve larger projects.
That subdivision started in the 90s and is just now getting completed. So,
25 years?
yeah, same owners too, just different developers buying lots.
Good luck, state.
So looking at the housing and demographic data for the city, which is presented in chapter 3 of the housing element, you'll see that housing, the number of housing units in the city has continued to increase, albeit more slowly over the last decade, and similarly the city's population growth has also, the growth rate has slowed down in the last 10 years. But you did see some more significant growth from 1990 to 2010 before the curve slows down a little bit.
How, based off your experience, do you attribute that to maybe the 2008 market bust?
Partially to the 2008 market bust, and then there's also the recession. There's also just a change to, not necessarily a change, but we're seeing a lot of housing development occur in areas that are close to I-5, close to 99, some of the bedroom communities of the Bay Area. So there's definitely development occurring at a pretty high rate throughout the state. I think when you're in a more rural area and you're not as connected to the regional roadway system, you have a lot of, while you have a lot of capacity, you don't have a lot of 100-acre sites where someone can come in and do a really huge development. So a lot of the larger developers, they're looking for really large pieces of land that they can come in and develop. So I think that's one of the reasons you're still not seeing as much growth as the rest of the state. In terms of the housing characteristics, the majority of homes in the city are owner occupied, about 68% compared to 32% that are rented. About 5% of households are overcrowded, meaning an average of more than one person per room. And the city has a vacancy rate of 6.8%. And the state typically considers a 5% vacancy rate to be standard. So when you have a 6.8 vacancy rate and you're not producing a lot of housing, it definitely is an indicator that there's not a super strong demand right now. When you start seeing the vacancy rate down around 3 and 4%, that means that there is more and more demand for housing. In terms of affordability, and this, throughout the state, housing units just aren't affordable, both for renters and for owners, so this isn't something that is solely an issue for Escalon. So 46% of households with a mortgage overpay for housing. And when you're talking about overpayment, that means those households are paying more than 30% of their monthly income toward their housing costs. Now, when a lender goes and approves a loan, a lot of times they'll let you they'll loan up to 35% of someone's income. So they actually assume that people can pay more than what the state and federal government assume to be affordable. So right there you have something that increases the number of people that are overpaying just by the virtue of how lending occurs. Now, 62% of your lower income households with a mortgage that are homeowners are overpaying for housing, so you definitely are seeing a higher rate of overpayment among the lower income households. And similarly, most of the rental households in the city overpay for housing, and 83% of the lower income rental households are overpaying for housing.
97%?
That's a special aggregation of HUD data, so it's a select,
Okay.
it's not, they do not survey 100% of renters in the city.
Okay, because that seems real extreme.
And it really jumped from the previous survey to this one, so it might also just be because we noticed that in our office, we're like, did we get the wrong numbers? But it might be a sampling issue as well. So in addition to looking at the housing needs of the general population and just the city's housing allocation, the state also asks the city to consider the housing needs of special needs groups. So these are populations that might have a harder time finding housing, they may have special housing needs, and they may be more likely to be lower income or burdened by their housing needs. And so 13% of the population in the city is seniors that are 65 years or older. About 15.3% of households are large households. They have 5 or more members, and that typically means you want to see more 3 and 4 bedroom units to accommodate those larger households. Almost 15% of the households in the city are headed by a single parent, so they're single parent with children. 9% of persons in the city have a disability, and in some cases disabilities mean they might need special accessibility features in their home. There's about 4 unsheltered homeless persons in the city based on the most recent point in time survey. And then the state also asks the city to look at the number of farm workers in the city, and the census data doesn't aggregate just the farm workers, so we have the identification that there's 228 persons residing in the city that are employed in agriculture, hunting, and mining industries, so in a broader sector than just farming. But about 200 people that may have needs for agricultural housing. So going back to the regional housing needs allocation, this is the number that is allocated by the state to the Regional Council of Governments and then is distributed down to the city. And the city's current allocation spans from 2014 to 2023. And in allocating the numbers out to the individual jurisdictions, the cities in the unincorporated county, the San Joaquin Council of Governments considers zoning, the availability of sites, the availability of resources and services, and they also look at where there are under concentration of lower income households and over concentration of lower income households, so that those numbers can be apportioned to provide a more balanced distribution of lower and above moderate income households throughout the county. And as we talked about, the city is not required to build the units or to require the units to be built, but the city does have to take actions to facilitate the development of those units. So the city has to ensure that there's enough land available to accommodate those units, and that constraints to the production of those housing units that are within the city's control are addressed.
Is it prudent to, the city's policy in the past is will be favorable to the developers to pay in lieu rather than to put in these homes. That's just a fact. Should the city change its direction and even out, not penalize, but even out the opportunity for developers to create this type of housing versus paying in lieu, because in lieu is too inexpensive, and there's nothing getting built because of that. So how do you suggest we, or the city, address that?
So that's a hard question, because when you have a small amount of housing, you're only going to get a couple of moderate or lower income units if you're requiring your inclusionary units to be constructed on site. If you're allowing those units, if you're collecting the in-lieu fees, and the in-lieu fees are calculated where they're reasonable, so they're not an impact to the developer, but they're adequate enough for the city to actually do something with the money, the city could then turn around and use those in-lieu fees to do perhaps a first-time homebuyer program or other programs that create new affordable housing units. So in either regard, you would be creating new housing. I think when you don't have a lot of demand for housing in the city, to have a high inclusionary requirement or an onerous inclusionary requirement makes it even harder to get even your market rate housing built. So I think the city has a good program in place, and it is appropriate to be flexible with the developers, because like you saw, you have smaller projects coming through where providing one unit as part of the project might be overly costly to the developer. So if you're having larger projects coming through, then you would want to continue to require those projects to provide some on-site units. But where you have smaller projects, I do think it's appropriate to continue to collect the fee.
I think the city has a lot of little areas that they can do that. There's, the 425 isn't achievable based on the way the city conducts its business or addresses its land use. So would it, city has a chunk of money in lieu fees, would it be something to consider to maybe create their own housing projects?
Cities could create their own housing projects. You could also put out a request for proposals, so you could let the development community know how much money you have available, and then you could request that they submit ideas as to, you know, what can they provide the city? Can they come in and provide one or two?
I think we talked about this 4 years ago.
Yeah, there's a lot of things.
Has anything happened with that?
And I don't know if your funds have been large enough that you've gone out and advertised them, but we can note that, and we could have a program that encourages that, and I can help Dominique put together some advertising material to see kind of just what feedback you would get.
Because that was a large push 4 or 5 years ago by the state, and they updated the groups that were to be notified
Right.
of these funds and the ability. I don't know what we've done with that in the last 4 or 5 years, but it'd be nice to have that included in this.
May I ask a question? So SJCOG gets 40,360 units. And, I'm sorry, did you finish?
Yeah,
Commissioner
go ahead.
Danziger? So there are larger municipalities that are in this organization, such as Stockton, Lodi, Manteca, that have the land available. So what happens if Manteca, Stockton, Lodi, they have the land and they actually they build more than their allocation, and then there are municipalities like Escalon that we won't make the mark? Does it all even out in the eyes of the state, or do they look at it as on an individual basis?
So the state does not review that on, the state does not review the cumulative performance of the whole COG. The state will review, when they're looking at your annual reports, they're going to look at each jurisdiction and your progress towards achieving your allocation. However, in the next cycle, when the state allocates a new set of numbers to the region, it will look at existing housing needs and projected future housing needs. So when it's looking at the existing needs for the region, areas that have overproduced or produced in excess, those units would then kind of decrease the overall allocation to the region. So they won't individually get credit for extra units in the next cycle necessarily.
Okay.
Although depending, so they could, but so the state, though, in the larger scheme of things, you would regionally get some credit for that. Now, would be really good to pay attention to is when the next cycle, when the next allocation occurs, SJCOG develops its own methodology as to how the units are allocated throughout the region. And so they can look at areas that are, you know, transit-oriented areas or high-quality transit areas and say we want to put more high-density housing and lower-income housing around these areas. So you can participate in that methodology and comment on it and encourage the COG to give the city a number that's reasonable and achievable. And so you can participate in that process. However, the COG often gets a larger number than all of the jurisdictions usually want to decrease their numbers. So no one's typically clamoring for a higher number.
So then, I guess what takes order of precedence, because based off what you've told us previously, the housing element is a requirement of the state. And as far as order of precedence goes, what takes precedence, whether it's a local ordinance or a local, like for example, here in Escalon, we have the slow growth ordinance. And then other cities such as Stockton or Lodi have a green belt ordinance where they're saying, no, we're leaving this area green. So what sets precedence, local or the state?
So the local ordinances would not set a precedence in terms of if the state, when the state allocates the numbers to the COG and the COG allocates the numbers to each jurisdiction, if your ordinances are so restrictive that you can't accommodate your allocation, then you need to go and review like your growth management ordinance and see if you can increase the numbers or how you can restructure that. You might want to, and we went through and changed this after, I believe, your 2010 housing element. So you may want to count affordable units, give them a higher credit so they only require a half a unit. For areas that have greenbelt ordinances, then they're going to have to look and see internally, okay, where can we identify underdeveloped sites, where can we increase capacity, because they're still going to have to be able to accommodate their fair share.
Because I think of our constituents here in Escalon, and we've talked about this before, where this is a state mandate, and the reality is, if we tell our constituents, oh, well, it's a state mandate, and now we have to make all of these, we have to amend the slow growth ordinance to accommodate this state law. I mean, there'll be people burning down the doors and throwing us off the planning commission and re-electing governments, and I mean, I think the state, I understand the importance of it, but I also think the state needs to be sensitive to that as well.
And it's a one-size-fits-all, seems like, in that there's no reason, there's no industry moving into town that's going to create more of a need for workforce and more housing for that workforce. So just because Stockton is, can decide to build 2,000 homes in a year, or Tracy, the same way, I don't know how you penalize Escalon. I see us being shoved into 0 lot lines. I see affordable units or secondary housing units
Accessory dwelling.
being shoved down our throats. I think they should be allowed, but I don't think they should be mandated necessarily. I see the way things going through our council, and this will come up during communication, where setbacks are going away. And I just, this town isn't ready for that kind of stuff. And I don't know how you're going to enforce, on a city.
And so what happens is when the state reviews your housing element, if you aren't identifying programs to remove constraints, so where the city's requirements conflict with state law, for example, the accessory dwelling unit requirements, if you have more restrictive standards, then we have to include a program to change those standards. And if you don't include that program, then the state will not certify your housing element. If you include that program and you don't implement it, in the next round, the state might conditionally certify your housing element and say, okay, you're promising again that you're going to do it. We'll give you 1 year to do it, and if you haven't, we're taking away your certification. So that is what the state holds in terms of being able to encourage you to comply. And so it used to be that there was, a limited number of lawsuits when jurisdictions did not have a housing element that was certified and they weren't enforcing their housing element. And those were typically by special interest groups. And what we're starting to see is that the Attorney General and the Governor are identifying communities that have decided to specifically not accommodate their housing needs, or they aren't taking appropriate steps as identified by state law. And so they're targeting those communities now, as opposed to waiting for some other entity that's been harmed by that to actually be the one to initiate the action. So I think the city if the city were to decide it did not want to comply with state law and it did not want to make those changes to the zoning ordinance, you would be painting a big target on the city in terms of what the state might opt to do.
I know Bay Area cities aren't complying. Menlo Atherton isn't complying with this, Menlo Park's not complying with this, and those little pockets in there where there's more millionaires than anybody else there, they don't listen to this stuff, and they fight it. I mean, I think they all go in and hire attorneys and things, where the city of Escalon's not gonna do that, but yet, I never hear anything about them. You know that they're not doing this.
So most of the jurisdictions in the state, not all, do have, and some of the upper income jurisdictions that you wouldn't expect do have a certified housing element. In some cases, they've been very proactive when their regional housing need allocation was given out, and they've managed to keep their numbers very low. In a lot of cases, they're essentially built-out communities, and they can encourage the COG in their area to allocate those units to other jurisdictions. So that sometimes happens, so you see those jurisdictions with
Is there a
low
way you
numbers.
can, we usually get graphs, and like when we're doing water rates and things like
Yeah.
that show us other communities,
Yeah.
and their compliance with all of the things that are coming to us. Is there a way to include that in our,
Let's see, I'll see what I can provide. I don't know that there's a great tracking tool for compliance with all the state laws, but in terms of having a certified housing element, we can provide some information for
well,
that.
I'm sure the state keeps records of
Yeah,
that.
oh, yeah.
They do, it's on their website.
Yeah, that, we can do the certified housing element and then implementation, some of the implementation things.
Well, not to interrupt your presentation anymore, but, and this is a rhetorical question, but does the state have common sense that understand that the more restrictions or things such as housing element forces it on smaller municipalities, that people will just get tired and say, I'm tired of all the laws and regulations, and I'm just gonna move. And then they leave the state of California, and then populations drop, but you're still mandated to follow the housing element to build these these units. What does the state say about that?
I think the lobbying groups are running the housing elements. You know, legislatures pass the laws, but they're lobbied. And so they're lobbied by builders, they're lobbied by people trying to find low and moderate income housing. And that's what really drives all of this. And those individuals don't care how big or small your town is. They're wanting to have this blanketed across the state, so that wherever they go, it's all the same to them. And each community looks at things differently, obviously, and it's really a shame. I mean, there's no voice here for us, you know. We have one council member that goes to COG, and COG is in a small county, and, you know, la-da-da-da-da, it just keeps going.
One last question. I know we can't fight it, but and this is more for Dominique and Tammy, have there been any discussions with Mr. Flores' office about these unrealistic expectations put on Escalon, and try to push back on the state and saying that, you know, we're working hard to achieve these 425 units, but I guess, and I'm not expecting an answer, but I mean, how hard can we really push back on the state? I don't think we can.
Yeah, it's really not something that you can, I mean, we're small. We just recently had a small communities kind of group that's formed under, or with Assemblymember Flores' office, and so we met once, and we're trying to get back together to discuss things that are impacting the smaller cities in the county. So we had met with Ripon, Waterford, Houston was supposed to go because, but they were unable to make it. And I think there was one other city that they had included, but I can't remember. Was it Lathrop? Did they still include
No.
Lathrop?
No, I think that was it.
That was it. And we were discussing all of these regulations, because it's not just affordable housing. There's a lot of stuff in water, storm water, I mean, just, I had a list that I thought we would discuss all of them, because I made this big giant list of things that we just aren't able to manage without either hiring all the staff or charging everybody a lot of money to be able to do it. And so we're basically trying to keep up with things as best as we can. And yeah, affordable housing came up, but a lot of water restrictions and stormwater, and so we're looking at trying to meet more frequently and trying to put something together that maybe Assemblymember Flora's office could be of some assistance to us in that area. I don't know if you have any further comment.
No,
But
I
it
would just
impacts
say
us
with,
differently.
I would say with the climate, in the capital and the push for housing, it's going to be a tough battle.
But they're feeling it just like we are as a small community, like, these aren't issues for us.
Right.
You know, you're making us address stuff that aren't even concerns at our level. We don't have a lot of transportation, a lot of this affordable housing, they're wanting you to build it all around these transportation systems to make things easier. We don't have that because we have the need, but our population doesn't meet with that, to the extent that it's unmet, and so we're giving what we can.
That's an affordable,
Yeah.
unmet transit.
Yeah.
So you mean the light rail between Escalon and Manteca isn't really gonna go in anytime soon?
No,
Yeah, I'm not thinking so.
yeah.
It seems like,
Ace train.
Beth, you have a lot of instances where you point out our size, our limited water availability, our wastewater. You point out things that we don't necessarily have a lot of control of at this point. So, or that we've already taken steps to counter, and in a lot of cases, it looks like you're maybe removing the target from us to some extent, you know, and like the ministerial approval on housing, we've already done it with accessory dwelling units, and to do it with homes, that's kind of interesting to me. I'd be curious to know what kind of standards would have to be met, you know, to handle those. But we're taking what steps we can, and I've got other things I want to bring up later, but it just seems if we keep putting language in there to show, you say we should change the growth management ordinance, and rather than saying that we should, what about may have to change it? You know, I don't want to give them power over us, you know. We are taking some steps, we're considering things, but we're not gonna give in, you know, we're going to do what we can to help.
And that's what staff we've told Beth that in many of
Yeah.
different,
Well, it
in
was
different ways.
reflected
Yeah,
in
I mean,
several
it's
places.
one thing if the need is there. You know, we have people banging down the door, you know, we have this big demand, we need to start making changes. We haven't had anybody apply for 75 permits in a year in
Yeah.
over 10 years, and so that need's not there. And so to make changes to the growth management ordinance, to staff at this point, it doesn't seem like it's needed yet, because we were lucky if we had, this last year, I think the highest we had was 15 in the last, you know, and that's just finishing out an area that's been ready to be built for 25 years, 35 years, so.
That's high.
And-
Yeah, I mean, and that's pretty high for us, yeah.
And
so.
you talk about senior housing, and I've talked to somebody on the board at Bethany, and I've talked to somebody about that property where the old auction yard used to be, and to me, it seems like that's one step. And you point out that if you have a senior facility, they want to be near entertainment, they want to be near transportation, they want to be near all, and I like the fact that you point out all those things. So Escalon isn't going to snap their fingers and get a senior facility right away because we don't have those other things in place. And so I think that's good.
Or whatever developer or company that comes in and provides that is going to
Yeah.
have to provide that with
Put in
the
a bowling
services
alley,
in the
put in
building,
a-
yeah. And a lot of them do, when you see a lot
Yeah.
of independent living facilities, they have the transportation, they have the activities, and they set up a schedule where they have buses bringing people and stuff, but they pay for that, so the rent in those places, along with meals and everything, is higher because it's 100% covered for those people.
And you are completely right. A lot of the housing element is intended to demonstrate to the state that Escalon has been making a diligent effort to implement the housing element. While you can't create new development and, the city just can't go and develop the city. But you can have measures in place to accommodate it, and you can encourage it, and that's what the city has done. And you've actually you have a mixed-use development that's pretty exciting coming to town. And so you've done a lot to encourage development and facilitate it. And so that's our message to the state when they go, well, why hasn't Escalon, produced their 425 units? We say, well, they've done a lot.
At the rate that it's going, that mixed-use development is going to be in the next housing element pending still,
Yeah.
so.
And that's a lot of our discussion with the state too, is the city can even approve projects, but developers don't always pull the permits and build them in a timely fashion, and the city has done what it can. Well, I'll move on, so our audience can get to perhaps the point where they can talk to you as well. So in looking at the housing element, we look at the housing needs, we look at the city's allocation, and then we also look at the housing sites that are available in the city. So we identify the vacant and underutilized land that's available to accommodate new residential growth. We look at whether or not the city has access to funding sources like the CDBG and home programs that might assist in developing housing. And then we also look at what the city is currently doing. You have your affordable housing requirement. The city offers density bonuses as required by state law. You assist development projects like the Escalon Covenant assisted care project. The city went ahead and assisted them with their NEPA compliance, with their federal environmental review, and the city's made an effort to encourage and facilitate those projects so the city can provide incentives and streamlining to move projects along.
I like that that was not our fault. Somebody else is failing, it's not our fault.
The city has done a lot.
Yes.
So we look at whether or not the city has adequate sites to accommodate the regional housing need allocation, as well as a variety of housing types, including group homes, emergency shelters, transitional and supportive housing, and extremely low-income housing. And so in the housing element, there is an inventory of sites that identifies the properties by their APN, identifies the acreage, the zoning district, the general plan designation, and then also the capacity of each of those sites. So when we compare the city's potential sites for development against the regional housing need allocation, we see that the city has about 170 units of extremely low, very low, and low-income units that have been allocated. You have about 11.3 acres that are designated for multifamily housing, designated R3, and that will accommodate 229 units. One of the concerns the state has is that the largest site is not adjacent, so it's located on the rear of a very long, large parcel, so it's 1,000 feet from a public road. And so we had talked about that internally, and we were waiting to see if the state was going to consider that a constraint, so they might be asking the city to provide a program to move that site either within that parcel closer to the road or somewhere where you have a site that has better access to water and sewer infrastructure. So that's the one comment we might see with one of the R3 sites. For the moderate income need, the city has an allocation of 64 units, 9 of which have been constructed, and you have plenty of medium density land, R2 land, and that would accommodate 137 units. So your existing zoning accommodates more than your RHNA for your lower and moderate income units. And then for the above moderate, your allocation is 192 units, of which 37 have been constructed. And your low density designations accommodate about 108 units. So you have a little less capacity there. And our message to the state is where you can't accommodate those, there's plenty of like the moderate income sites that could be developed with market rate housing that could be above moderate, or market rate housing that could be moderate depending on the density and the type of development. That's really up to the development community and to the market forces. See where that comes in. And there's the figure in the site, in the housing element, that shows the inventory of sites, and you'll see, so in the industrial area, where Ulrey Avenue is, if you go south of Ulrey Avenue,
Use the mouse.
can you just highlight the one site?
You're better off doing that then.
Uh-oh, hold on.
Button.
Oh, there we go. This is the site I was discussing. It's 4.75 acres, and it's on a much larger parcel. And so the state might be asking the city to bump that closer to a road or swap it with another site that's more developable. So we'll see if that what request we get from the state there. But that wouldn't necessarily be something that, so a lot of times when you have to identify additional sites, there's a CEQA requirement, of course, that we have to review the environmental ramifications of that. In this case, you would just be moving density around within the city, so you wouldn't be increasing the overall capacity of the general plan. So I don't think that would have, it wouldn't generate the need to do an EIR or to do some long, expensive CEQA process. I think we can have that fall under the umbrella of the city's existing environmental document for the general plan. And I will talk to Dominique about some strategies for that. So plenty of sites with the provision that one of those sites might need to be moved around a little bit to better accommodate potential development. So in addition to looking at the sites, the housing element also addresses constraints to housing development, and that's in Chapter 5 of the housing element. We go through various governmental constraints, both state level constraints as well as constraints associated with the city's general plan and zoning code. And in most cases, the city's undertaken a number of programs to remove potential constraints. So there have been a lot of potential constraints that were noted in previous housing elements, and the city's taken actions to remove those. We also look at non-governmental constraints such as environmental factors, the availability of land, the availability of infrastructure, land costs, construction costs, availability of financing. And these are constraints that are largely outside of the city's control in terms of ensuring that they're met or removed for every developer. You can take some action to address some of these, like providing funding to reduce the cost of land, but you can't just go through the city and require developers to, or property owners to sell their land really inexpensively because you want new housing projects. So the meat of the housing element is in the housing plan, Chapter 6, and this identifies the city's specific goals for housing. It identifies policies, so that these become general plan policies, so when the city's making future decisions, the city has to make sure that the decisions are consistent with the general plan and consistent with the policies in the general plan. So the housing plan is really the meat of the housing element in terms of providing guidance for the future. And then it also includes programs, specific actions that the city will carry out during the life of the housing plan. When we went through the housing plan, you'll see that the majority of the programs are the same as the previous round. We carried forward the goals, policies, and programs that remain applicable and effective in the city. We streamlined a few policies and programs, so where we saw some opportunities to maybe cut out a program or two and consolidate things, we did. So it's one less thing for your staff to have to follow up on an annual basis. We removed those programs that had been completed. And then in a few cases, we added some new programs to ensure that the city has adequate sites, address the requirements of state law, and encourage development of the city's regional housing need allocation. And then we also created an implementation matrix to make it easier to track the city's housing programs. So you'll see Program 2.7. So that requires the city to develop an SB 35 streamlining process. So this is one of the state requirements that I had mentioned. So for jurisdictions that haven't developed an adequate amount or haven't seen development of an adequate amount of the allocation, they're required to implement a streamlining process so projects with an affordable component can be approved at a ministerial level. Similarly, for Program 3.2, would ensure adequate lower income sites, and it has a similar program but not the same program as the SB 35 process. So state law has also required in this current housing element round and future housing element rounds that if you have a vacant site that has been in more than 2 housing elements or an underdeveloped site that's been in more than 1 housing element, that you also include programs that would allow affordable projects with an affordable component to also be approved at the ministerial level on those sites.
We'll hold on there. So we have vacant property in town that we have no control over because the property owner may or may not want to do anything with it. And so if that property goes through 2 cycles, what's going to be the outcome?
So, and I'll pull open the actual program. So it's Program 3.2 on page 6.8 of the housing element. And so if you have, and these are for the lower income sites, so these are going to be the sites that are included in your inventory that have been carried forward, as I had mentioned, from 2 or more cycles if they're vacant, 1 or more if they're underdeveloped. And so they have to allow residential use by right, which is another term for ministerial, for housing developments that have at least 20% of the units that are affordable to lower income households. So that means that it's not subject to a conditional use permit, a planned development permit, or other discretionary review. However, the city can still develop affordable housing, or not affordable, but multifamily housing standards and requirements, kind of like a more robust design review requirement. So you can have standards that would be applied. They just have to be applied at on a ministerial level. And so this is a change that.
Let's bring it down to where we can digest this. The property out on 120, and was it Oklahoma? The 3.17 acres?
The old
Auction
auction
yard?
yard.
Auction yard? Yeah.
That's zoned what?
A portion of it's zoned R2, which is medium density, and I think another portion of it is zoned R1. They're both for sale. Oh, no, they're both zoned R2.
They're both, yeah.
Okay, they are medium density residential, and then our ordinance allows that because it's a residential project, or if it would be residential, it's over 1 acre, they can apply for a PD. So at any point in the PD, they could ask for modification on the density, higher or lower, depending on the type of project.
Okay, so they don't do anything for the next 20 years with that property. What does that mean to the city?
So that property is not one of your lower income sites, so it's not part of the inventory that would be subject to this program. So that site would not be affected by this program. It would be the sites that are included in table 4.3, and there's the far right-hand column of that table says included in previous housing element, and so that identifies which sites have been carried forward and would be subject to that program.
What property is that?
So we're looking at all of the city's R3 sites that are vacant, a few that are underdeveloped, and then 3 of the city's commercial sites.
Oh, that's the old winery vineyard. Looks good on paper.
And so this is where when you develop, so you don't have to develop the SB 35, that program doesn't have to be adopted with your housing element, it can be adopted in the future. And so it's something that you probably want to put some thought into the standards that you would be applying to those future developments that are subject to the streamlining provisions.
The streamlining provision basically short circuits any planning commission or any other type of hearings.
Correct.
Just moves things along. So there's no real input from the community via this dais here, or the ability for the public to come forward to say anything.
Right, you might have a notice on the site that it's being, considered for a ministerial permit, but any objections of the community, if they're not based in the project conflicting with the general plan or the zoning code, wouldn't be the reason to deny a permit. Any objections would have to identify the city's standards where the project is inconsistent.
So just because somebody doesn't like it there, doesn't hold water.
Right, and that's exactly what the state is trying to do away with. They're trying to not have that approach to, so when a developer looks at your inventory of sites, the thought is that all of those sites should be available to accommodate lower income development because they're included in your inventory.
And I want you to be able to move along here, but I will bring up one instance where we had 8 senior housing units proposed over on Plaza and Mesa, and it sounds like now, if this goes forward, we wouldn't have been able to address that development, and just because the community around it didn't like it because of whatever they thought, traffic or what have you, it wouldn't have mattered, that would have gone through.
Unless the traffic concerns were true hazards where they can, you might have a requirement you might have a standard that the development have adequate circulation. And so that standard, you would have to demonstrate that they provide adequate circulation so you could probably include standards that could address this, but you would have to be thoughtful in how you develop them, and there would have to be the potential for a project to be proposed that could comply with the standards. You can't have standards that just ensure that your sites don't get developed, but an appropriate project would have to be able to be approved on that.
Well, I'm just thinking in real terms of how projects have come through here before, where you have not well thought out parking areas around
And did that,
C2 areas and that kind of thing.
Did-
And then you have a project like that one that the existing community around it didn't want it because they thought it would be an imposition on their traffic, even though there was a traffic study done, albeit it was done between Christmas and New Year's, and nobody was out there, so school's out and what have you. How do we go about setting up these standards?
so that's something that staff would develop. They can hire a consultant, they can develop that internally, but that is something that the city would develop that would be adopted as part of the zoning code. So it would go to the planning commission, it would go to the city council, it would be adopted by ordinance. So there would be plenty of opportunity for the city and the community to provide input into the development of those standards. I also think the project you used as an example did not have an affordable component, so
I don't
this
think
would,
it did.
right, this would only apply to projects that have an affordable component. So, and there's a specific percentage of affordability they would have to meet, so.
And playing devil's advocate, we've got staff that have been with us a long time, and they're very capable. And for them to do some ministerial approval of something, whether it be an accessory dwelling unit or a low-income, I would trust them to use good judgment and
Oh, I would too,
make
but,
good calls.
but we're all not gonna be here in 10, 20, 15 years. So, what do you get after that? I don't know. Maybe we.
This will be redone by then.
And we've discussed with Beth moving forward with some multifamily design guidelines, just to make sure that when you're building the high-density residential, that it looks good in town and matches in the surrounding community, and so we'll be moving forward on that as well. We've got a lot of stuff in the next few years that we'll need to start moving forward on.
Okay.
And so there are a couple of additional programs that when we get comments from the state, we will have to ensure that we address these. So there have been 2 new bills that have been passed recently, and both of them are currently applicable. So we'll have to look, and I'll have to get all of the definitions and develop the appropriate programs, but providing for supportive housing as a ministerial use in zones where multifamily and mixed-use housing are permitted. And then also allowing low barrier navigation centers, which are like a homeless type of facility, by right in zones where multifamily and mixed uses are permitted, and that has to be subject to specified requirements. So we'll be looking into those standards and coming back to you with a program that addresses these requirements while also giving the city as much latitude as possible. So I just wanted to bring that up, so when you see the housing element again, you don't go, these programs weren't here before, why, is this a quick switch? It's not, it's just as the state's reviewing it, there's new bills that are being applied. So the next steps, we're in the second step of this process right now. The housing element is out for public review, and that public comment period ends October 22nd. So we'll also be getting the state's housing element comments in November. We are wrapping up the white papers and recommended policy sets for the environmental justice, climate change, and safety provisions, and those will be going to staff this month, and you'll be seeing those next month. So we're anticipating being back before you for adoption hearings in November, and then on to City Council in December. And so we do have a December 31st, 2019 deadline, so you're on the 4-year housing element cycle. It has to be adopted within 4 years. It doesn't have to be certified by the state in that time period, but it does have to be adopted, and then you have 1 more 4-year, and then you're back on the regular 8-year cycle. So if it's not adopted by that 4-year, then you have 2 more 4-year periods rather than 1 more 4-year period. So we're working hard to make sure that you can meet that
Get into that
requirement.
8-year.
Yeah, get you back to 8 years would be nice.
Yeah.
So we're hoping to hear from anyone listening, watching tonight from the comfort of their home. We would love to have some feedback and comments on the housing element. It's available for review here at City Hall, at the library, at the community center, online, and comments should be sent to Dominique. So that's and hopefully we will also take comments tonight from members of the public that are interested, I'm guessing.
Any more comments from the commissioner?
Will we be commenting after you bring it back? Or do you want to hear it now?
Well, I mean, or we can open it up and let,
I'd say open it up and then we can
Yeah.
come back.
Let them
yeah, let's
talk.
open it up. If you please step forward, state your name and address at the podium.
Good evening. My name's Dan Guevara. Not sure, my address, I don't live here. I pastor a church here in town, and my background is real estate, so I just wanted to sit in and listen in.
Any comments, or?
No, I mean, obviously, it's great to at least hear what, what is the hope or the future for the city, and I think really when it comes to development, I think those that are from here or have a desire to see, the proper direction and growth, I think would definitely be the key people to kind of, put some thoughts together and eventually, put some proposals for development. But it's exciting. Just wanted to sit in
Well,
today. Thank you.
for coming. Anybody else like to step forward?
We're just here to listen.
You're just here to listen. Okay,
Should've brought them
we'll
candy.
bring it back. Any comments from the commission?
I've got 3 pages of notes.
I
Things
just,
to bring up.
Is that a yes?
Yeah.
I just have one brief comment before Commissioner Willis gets into her 3 pages of notes.
Tone.
And that is to our constituents who are watching this or are not watching this, just as a reminder, and we brought this up when Beth was here last time, is that this is state mandated. And we don't really have a choice, because if we don't respond, then the city of Escalon could find ourselves in some serious issues with the state. And so it's not really a choice, it's just trying to get ahead of yet another state of California regulation. So Beth and Dominique and all other staff that has been working on this, thank you. I know it's, I wouldn't say it's a labor of love. I would say it's a labor, but it's appreciated.
You want me to just launch into my? Well, one thing I brought up, on page 211, you say the growth management ordinance should be revised to ensure that the city can accommodate the remainder of its RHNA. Can we change that to may have to be revised or something a little gentler? We're thinking about it, but we're not gonna act rapidly, harshly.
Should add if it becomes an impediment.
Okay, yeah. On page 3-3, I'm a little, okay, you've got 90% of the people are white, and then 26.4% of Hispanic origin.
So when the census is sent out, it has 2 separate categories. One for race that does not include Hispanic origin. It's the white, black, and African American, American Indian, Asian, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, another race, or multiple other races. And so that's the race. And then separately, regardless of what people have chosen for their race, they can also answer whether or not they're of Hispanic origin. So there's some overlap in those categories.
Okay.
So you can enter it twice?
So you can enter white, black, Asian, whatever race you want, and then separately, you can't enter being of Hispanic origin twice, but then you would choose your race, and then your ethnicity is a separate option, and so a separate answer.
So these are just things, some of which I've already mentioned, but, and some of which you do already, but convey in the housing element that the city is doing all it can to comply, that it's not the city's fault if the building in Escalon doesn't pencil out to developers and whatnot. And you talked about the Covenant Church, that, their money issues aren't anything that we're bringing about. And then like I talked about, like with seniors, we've got limited services, limited transportation, for seniors and for low income. And you seem to bring that out in a couple of places, so that's good. on 3-9, and you said something about this, I just was struck by how the percentage of owner occupied went down and the percentage of renter occupied went up. And you said it was probably based on,
Well, for the tenure, I'm not so sure. So the overpayment increased significantly, and so I don't know if that was just due to the sampling. The owner, I think the increase in tenure, so the increase in renter occupied units is something that we're seeing across the state. Just as housing becomes less affordable, you're seeing, and more people are holding on to homes and renting them out. So has been just an overall increase in the number of renters, so.
okay, they're holding on to them and renting them out, and where are they?
Living
Another house.
elsewhere.
They go
Or
back.
you have, a homeowner in Escalon who buys into a newer home, or, an older family that might want to rent a larger home and move into a smaller home. So you see all kinds of things, but basically people are not necessarily selling their units for sale when they can rent them sometimes.
Okay. On, in table 3-17, vacancy by type, the numbers don't add up.
81, 152. Yes, you are correct. I will double check this.
Okay.
She's only on the first page, Beth.
On the second page.
Well, it's good we're hearing it tonight, since at your next meeting you'll have your 3 CUPs and you might have a much longer evening, so.
Okay, and I just want to verify, in table 3-19, the RHNA, it does include ADUs.
We are counting them toward the RENA, so we'll
Okay.
see what the state says. So far, they've let us do that. and
Okay.
They've let the city do that.
Okay. 411, let's see what that is. Okay, you're talking about system capacity and operation, a little more than halfway down, and you're talking about the current system has sufficient capacity as long as conservation measures remain in place. Well, what about remain in place and are complied with?
I think this assumes that they're complied with. So I think when
Okay.
your consultants are calculating that, they're assuming that those are
Okay.
being enacted.
Page 5-33, the fees. Wow, did some of those fees go up and some went down? Have we adjusted all of them, or are we still examining housing, the subdivision fees and,
No, those were all reviewed, and then they're set up for annual inflators. Some of them are 2.74, some of them increase at the end of December, and some of them increase in July.
okay. There were some great differences in some of those.
Before you move on, and on top of her statement there, as we move to ministerial approvals, are any of these fees going to go away that don't come in front of us?
They'd have to definitely be looked at again, if they're not going before boards.
Should we
And-
qualify, maybe a sentence about with the increase in ministerially approved housing, that the fees
Maybe reduced.
may be adjusted?
And will have an impact on future city services?
Yeah.
Well, so your fees have anticipated that all of your allowed development would occur. So your fees are calculated to assume that that development would occur. So you wouldn't necessarily increase your fees because the development that you based your fee on actually happened. If anything, if you're not seeing development, your fees would actually need to go up so that you could pay for sewer improvements and things that you need. So
But that's going to be a constraint.
that would be, and I don't think we want to have a policy in the housing element that ties any increase in fees to approval of housing.
I just think there needs to be a
projects.
statement there that, in parentheses even,
Right.
that if we had to lower these because of ministerial reviews, bypassing current review process, that there'll be less fees collected by the city, which would in turn be less fees the city collects and can use.
we will include something along those lines. So a lot of projects that are approved ministerially would still have to pay all of the applicable fees. They wouldn't not be subject to the fees. The only time you're not going to see where some of the state law has changed how fees are collected is for the accessory dwelling units. So they're not going to be paying water and sewer fees. They're going to be fewer fees that accessory dwelling units will pay. But most of your other units are going to pay the standard fee.
My last note, good job. Looking at the previous housing element and this one, there was continuity. You could see where you inserted the new information, like the ADUs and the new, made changes where necessary, and it was seamless. And, good job. And good job. Lots of data in this.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm done.
Okay. I also think you did a very good job, too. It's a lot easier to read than it was 4 years ago, I think, because I don't think maybe things have changed, but it just looks more congruous, and I appreciate that. On page 311, we may have already addressed this, but the total, there's a
317.
yeah, at the bottom, the total number there is 2.
Oh, wait a minute, that
I see
total.
that as
That's a little
well.
bit off, too.
I'm not sure if that's a typo or what.
And I also saw the totals in the fee tables somehow had a previous total next to the new total. So,
Had that written down. also.
yeah, sometimes we use fields to calculate totals and they don't always, like when we PDF it, it'll repopulate a few things sometimes, and I didn't catch those. What's that?
Under Goal 6, energy efficiency, the new state law requirement for solar on all new dwellings, whether, I guess it doesn't matter if they're low to above moderate income housing, they all have to have solar. Is that correct?
There are a few exemptions, I believe, and I don't remember the exact exemptions. I think there are a few instances where you might not have to have solar, but yes, in general, your new single-family housing will have solar, and I'm not sure about the multifamily solar requirements.
There's no qualifiers like how many square foot?
We'll look and see.
We'll have to look. Well, we're currently in process of reviewing the new changes for the California Building Code that will become effective in January, and then that's gonna go to council in November. So we just started that this
Okay.
last week.
Because I'm going to reiterate what I said last time, and that's
Yeah, the water heaters, tankless water heaters.
yeah, and I'm not an expert on this. I don't know if, under new construction, if a tankless water heater is more efficient than a water recirculating pump. So I think you're going to go to the engineer and get his thing. I think that needs to get done pretty quick, so that we can include that in maybe our only one amendment to the building code. And
But can I just tag something onto that? There's so much talk these days about the blackouts and how if you have solar, you need to have backup and so if we have solar, do we also have a requirement for backup?
well,
Like the
that was going to be a
inverters.
question of mine later on.
Oh,
Because I don't think solar, if you get your power turned off, powers your house.
No.
No.
It doesn't
it
do that.
doesn't.
Yeah,
But if it's backed up,
You need battery.
if
Yeah.
you're
Need batteries and an inverter, yeah.
So, kind of sidebar to that,
Yeah, please.
when the gentleman was here from PG&E talking about the solar, or about the pending shutoffs,
Yeah.
I made a suggestion. What was his name? Kyle?
No, Dylan George.
Dylan. So I suggested to Mr. George that to help all PG&E customers, why doesn't PG&E think about purchasing a bunch of generators at cost and then give a rebate back to their customers? Or if you have solar, work with a battery manufacturer such as Tesla or LG or Panasonic, one of the other battery backup systems, do a rebate system. And he said.
You'd have to reconfigure your electrical and
Yeah.
transfer switches at your own house.
Yeah.
I mean, you're looking at an expensive
But-
proposition. Plus, is PG&E going to pay for the permits?
But the cost to do, right now, the average battery backup system costs almost the exact same as putting an entire solar system on your house.
Yeah.
But the cost most of the cost is in the battery. So batteries right now are about $6,000 to $8,000 just for the battery itself, not install, whatever. But I thought, man, it's a win-win because PG&E wouldn't have to worry about all these homeowners being affected by the power. They could get, I mean, it's a huge monopoly.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if they're gonna include that in the housing element, but,
I like the idea there.
Possibly in,
Energy
just say,
security, it's good for all of the seniors, disabled, and at-risk population to have.
because a lot of times people wanna know, well, where's the cutoff? Where would you require this? And I think that, as far as the water recirculation or the heated tank, I think that's all new construction, no matter what. And then pick a number, anything over 1,000 square feet for home remodels, and a cost. I think the cost shouldn't start until you surpass the solar. So if somebody wanted to put in solar, you wouldn't necessarily hit them with the water, because if that broke the camel's back, they wouldn't do the solar. So just a thought. I don't have any
we could
expertise in
definitely
this.
take a look at those.
Yeah, because you want people to, conserve whenever they can, and you don't want them to stop that just because that fee might be attached to it. I don't know if these questions are now or later, but I think that I'm gonna do it later. Yeah. Good job, good job.
Your comments?
Well, a good job on trying to keep up with all the changes that the state's requiring. That's a task.
I just see it as a perfect storm where they keep saying, okay, more regulations, more regulations, more regulations, and then people are gonna move and not have then cities and municipalities aren't gonna have the tax revenues to support doing a housing element.
That's right.
I mean, I have not spent time in the Modesto homeless camp, but I know, based off my own personal, not my own personal experience, but experience within my family, that there is a certain percentage, whatever that is, of homeless people that choose to be homeless. And I think the state is mandating low-income housing. We need this, we need that, we need that, and so when does it end?
I don't mind low-income housing, because I know when I was starting out there, I was living in an apartment, it was $125 a month, and we were making $250 an hour while I was going to school, and people need a place to start. That's what I picture and envision, and I think each community owes it to their population to have a place to start, and it commensurate with how big you are, I guess. But I don't know that we should house, a 15% population of homeless in San Joaquin County. When we have 4 people here, I don't know. But when I think low-income housing, just for my fellow commissioners, I think people just starting out need a toe up, waiting for those raises to come in so they can move up to the next house along the line there. So there has to be that, where you just price them right out of your neighborhood. I couldn't live where I worked before I retired. I lived 20 miles away. It just couldn't live in that town. It just didn't get that kind of money.
My next statement is a joke, and so I want everybody to know that it's a joke. But, in Escalon, we don't deal with homeless people, we just drop them in Modesto. So,
It's a joke
It's
that
a
never
joke.
dies.
it's a joke.
Any other comments? Okay, we'll close this section. Next item is matters presented from the audience on any other topic you would like to talk about.
Nothing?
Staff communications?
So as I informed some of you before the meeting, our November meeting is going to be pretty rock solid. A lot of stuff going on along with the housing element. We do have some conditional use permits and some variances that'll be coming forward, application-wise. It'll be a busy night, and we did need to move it a week back, so that meeting will be on Tuesday, November 19th, instead of the originally scheduled date of Tuesday, November 12th. So if you cannot make it, if you can let me know, we need to make sure we have a quorum, and if that date doesn't work out, then we would need to reschedule on another day. I'm trying to think of anything. We've got a lot of stuff going on, a lot of projects under review. I mean, they're smaller projects, you know, use permits, variances, changes to things in town. But it definitely keeps the staff busy. A couple other state mandates that staff is working on. You know, there's new recycling law that's gonna be moving forward. So Diana and Jenny have been working diligently on prepping for that, and we have some meetings at county level, that we'll be looking at. That's gonna get tighter, which is gonna make some changes in the next 5 years, and they're gonna be implementing, much like stormwater, a 5-year plan where cities take that 5 years to get into the process and get things ready to implement over 5 years, and then we'll be
Just like a
reporting
third
annually.
garbage can?
It appears it's gonna be going back to that fashion where we'll be, you know, requiring to do some amount of compost, recycling, can recycling, glass recycling, maybe the third can. It's been difficult, because things are in the air. When we talk to our current, refuse company at this point, they're still waiting to hear back on what they need to do, and until they know what they need to do, it kind of leaves us hanging on what we need to do to an extent. We will be updating our trash ordinance as well, because it's very outdated. I think it was 1968. We haven't touched it in a while, so we'll be updating that.
As long as you leave the fees down.
Yeah, there's no fees so much attached to that one, but we will be updating that and getting things going. But we do, you know, we have a lot of stuff at that level going on. We actually have somebody that's assigned to us with Cal Recycle from the state who actually makes visits. She's been here twice, almost 3 times, probably 3 times this year. And we've actually taken them out, and we are looking in people's garbage cans, and they want to see what people are throwing out. And that's basically how this law is coming into effect, is seeing what people are putting into those cans and what's going to the landfills and what the companies are having to dispose of, and making sure that it's disposed of properly, and if there's ways to not dispose of it, what we can do to offset that. And so it's gonna be interesting. We also are moving into the business license renewal period, so those will be going out next month. We try to work diligently on everybody renewing their business licenses on time, to avoid fees or late fees. And we encourage that if you know any businesses or have friends that have businesses, that they go ahead and get it handled right away, so that we don't have to chase them down later. 'Cause we don't like doing that, but we will.
Every opportunity to succeed.
Thank you, Dominique.
No problem.
Any,
Oh, I did have one more item. I almost forgot, and it was the biggest one. So in the last few months, we have been receiving some inquiries with wineries, breweries, winemaking, beverage production, seeking to come into town. A lot of it is just people trying to get an idea. If I was to come into Escalon, where could I go? Currently, those types of uses are only permitted in our M1 and M2, which are our light industrial and our heavy industrial. As we're aware, with some changes we made this last year, opening up some of our commercial areas to conditional use permits, when it came to other businesses trying to do additional things. We know that there's some properties in town that may actually be pretty successful at providing that service or having that type of business located there, that maybe would not be as large of an impact to the community or residents surrounding it. So we were wondering if the Planning Commission would be open to looking at that section of the code and possibly amending it to a conditional use permit, where if somebody wanted to come in, you know, with the brewery, and perhaps with that brewery slash restaurant or whatever, they're actually doing some wine production. Not at a heavy rate where they have a bunch of deliveries and stuff like that. We have more folk that like to do their own stuff and maybe sell it. So it wouldn't be too heavy, the ones that have come so far. That maybe we'd be open to accepting a conditional use permit application and actually letting them come to planning commission and show that they wouldn't be a heavy impact to the community.
So you're talking wineries or breweries? Because I heard brewery in there.
Wine making,
Okay.
wine tasting. We've been getting some inquiries on having like wine tasting rooms.
Is this like one of those
Brewery.
businesses where you make your own wine and brew your own beer?
Yeah, I mean, two of them that have come forward in the last few months have been similar to that. They're making their own beer, they're making their own wine. So they call it production because they are producing it, but they're not producing it at levels where they're attracting a bunch of traffic and having a lot of pickup and drop off and stuff like that. And then they want to be able to sell it or have people come in and taste it. It's becoming a little bit more popular, but right now we don't permit it at all in the commercial areas. In the future, we would like to see some type of business like that come into town, a brewery where they'd maybe have a restaurant component along with that, maybe along the 120 at some point in the future. But currently, our codes as they are would not allow for that unless they were in industrial. So that would push them over here on the McHenry side and
You got the Rite Aid.
yeah, and that area is also C2, so it would not be allowed there as well, at all. Where at least if we opened up for a conditional use permit and told them, you know, what the issues that would come up at planning commission level, which majority of them are being backed up to residential. So obviously some other areas of the C2 are backed up against housing, how they would be able to mitigate that issue or address it. And then we do have some areas in town that don't have that issue in the future that could possibly turn into something. So we wanted to see if you'd be open to giving them that opportunity if they wanted to. Which, of course, the use permit is a process, so I mean, their application, they're coming to planning commission, they're paying their fees, which are about $1,100 right now to move forward. We always let them know there's no guarantee, and we can't make any promises, but that does provide them the opportunity to know what the issues are and go about trying to address how they might mitigate them or prevent them from occurring, so. That's something
I
would
would
be.
see what happens.
I'd be in favor of anything that could encourage business, especially along 120.
Okay.
And a decent place to eat.
Yeah, well, yeah, and that, because, you know, it depends on what the operation, if it's primarily producing beer or wine, it probably ought to be more.
Yeah, and we would look
industrial.
into
If
language on
it's-
that.
If it's more of an emphasis on a restaurant with, you know, the sidebar, the wine or beer making, you know.
Yeah, so we would be trying to focus the language on any amendment or change that we make to the code to have that more as like the incidental or secondary use in that area, trying to focus more on either a restaurant or a tasting room, those type of things where on the side they'd be doing production, but not at some heavy level, which that's something that staff would have to look into on how to write that up in the right terms, so. But as long as you guys are open to it, we'll look into getting that done. Just in the last few months, we've had a lot of inquiries on that, either on Main Street, and then, along 120.
I can see
So.
120 being,
As long as they know they gotta pay their fees there, nothing's guaranteed, I'd be looking at anything.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
I have a question for staff. Is that all right?
staff communication?
In the housing element, effectiveness and appropriateness, policies and programs, talks about the Improvement Bond Act, under which residents can install curbs and gutters and have the cost added to their taxes. That issue we had a couple of months ago with,
Claire's,
I wasn't gonna use a name, the people at the corner of Kern and Yosemite. Was that, Improvement Bond Act discussed with them, offered to them?
So in past instances where I've brought up something like that with residents as an alternative, because along with projects such as those, we also run into issues where there are sidewalks in town that people trip over and they report them to the city, and so our job is to reach out to the property owner and advise them that in accordance with the highway code, they'd be responsible for making those repairs. If we do get, where they don't have the money to be able to do that, we do provide alternatives, and we have mentioned that to people in the past.
This particular applicant, I think money was part of the issue, but then the other part was the engineering feasibility of it, so I wasn't sure if
Yeah.
that had come up
Which
or
our
not.
engineer had thought it was feasible. It would need a little fine tuning, but he still found it to be feasible in that case. They're just not interested in putting it on their property tax. Yeah. And typically the ones I've seen in the past, which I haven't seen any done in this city, but in a prior city I worked with, they usually didn't do it unless the whole block or the whole neighborhood wanted to do it. So it was more cost efficient to do it in that manner, where you do a whole construction project and mail everybody out, and if everybody was in agreement, or they'd sign a petition and try to move forward with it, then the city would go ahead and complete that work for you and then put it on the bond, and you'd pay it over 10 years. And so we just haven't gotten there in terms of streets or people being willing to have that done. And then in instances where we've offered it, to single households, they don't want to pay it through their property tax. So, but we still do put it out there just in case.
Okay.
It is still an option. It's just not a widely used one here.
Any comment?
Yeah. Are you
Are
done?
we up to commission communications?
Yeah, I said that.
Oh.
Commission, yeah.
Oh, because I was under,
Oh, you're under staff.
But
Okay.
now
Okay, now
Well-
we'll open up.
Go for it.
Okay.
we had an issue where we denied the applicant what he wanted, and we have a system in place. He appealed to the city council, and he won. So on the one hand, the system works, that's good. On the other hand, there were comments made by a couple of the city council members about it looking nice, and that, let me see if I can get the exact, he takes good care of the property, and that's why we should approve it. And I was reading a book recently that talked about how judges make decisions based on the law. And I'm not going to elevate us to judges, but we are appointed to observe a code. The city council, on the other hand, is elected to give the constituents what they want. So our aims are a little bit different. It was somewhat frustrating that, where we have 5 feet, 10 feet, 15 feet, 20 feet that we have to abide by, and you can quantify that versus, oh, it looks good, it'll look nice, the neighbors will like it. You can't set something up like that. It's just too hard to follow. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. You're gonna have, for each person, you're gonna have a different view about what you should do or could do or can't do. And it was very frustrating for me to go through that. And so we're gonna have something that some people are gonna look at as an eyesore, some other people are gonna look at as, oh, that looks nice, he did a good job. Okay, off my soapbox.
Well, I'm going to step on your soapbox for a minute. And this message is primarily for the city council members. As a friendly reminder, I abstained from that vote, and I didn't attend the city council meeting where the appeal was raised. But it's the responsibility of the planning commission to follow and adhere to the zoning laws and regulations. That is why we are appointed in these positions. And Escalon is a small town, and they sometimes there is a certain sense of nepotism that takes place throughout the city. I'm not accusing anybody of anybody, but my very first concern is that to all the city council members, that they follow and adhere to the same zoning laws, rules, regulations, general plan, codes that we do. Because if we do our job that we were appointed to do, and we do it to the best of our abilities, and because of favoritism or nepotism or it looks good, will trump the decisions that are made at the planning commission level, then I think, I can't speak for the three of you, but kind of makes me wonder then, why do we even have a planning commission? So, all I'm saying is the planning commission and the city council need to work together. And if we don't, then we're gonna have this battle back and forth for years to come. And then unfortunately what happens is, as planning commissioners, we look like we have egg on our face because we're just trying to do our job. I have some other questions, but I
Well,
know
go ahead.
Commission, no, I know you have some issues to bring
Well,
up about this too.
I'll just talk about this one issue here and then let you guys get back as you started. I was at the council meeting as well, and as Commissioner Willis stated, first off, we are the standard bearers for the city. We look at the ordinances, we look at the zoning, we listen to staff, and then we make our decisions how those projects conform to those standards and those requirements. This one didn't meet that, and it was my feeling that because the next step up is the appeal, was the city council can make the decision, because it is a political decision. At that point, it is not a regulatory decision, and they based it on a council member's nexus with his neighbor, and how much he appreciated that he mowed his lawn and kept it up. That trumped city standards that had been in place for I don't know how long, and even though it was acknowledged by several city councilmen that we had done our job and they appreciated that, this wasn't any necessary reflection on us, that they were going to approve the variance, they were going to approve the conditional use permit, as well as overturn a 4-0 decision from their planning commission. It's frustrating for me, because I think we did our job, and I've been going to council meetings since 2008, that I've heard the arguments against these type of structures over and over again. Nobody has ever said one thing that, as they addressed it the other night, and approved it. They were all against, previous councils had been opposed to it. I am in the same boat that the gentleman was that presented this. I keep my house up. I've got a 34-foot trailer that's much nicer than his. I could put it right next to the side of my house and build the same type of structure over it, but I choose not to because it junks up the neighborhood. It's a standard. And when you see these things go up, you know, more and more, they junk things up. It's not a matter of whether somebody keeps up their property. It's the standard you want to bear in the community. Again, we're looking at that. They're looking at things politically. And, you know, I went up and I congratulated him afterwards. You know, I said, you did everything the right way. You came through, you tried to get a permit, you filed for the variance and conditional use permit. When you were rejected, you took it to the city council. That's what you do. And he prevailed, so, you know, congratulations. I also thought, you know, since you prevailed, you ought to get your money back for the appeal. You know, why should you have to pay if you appealed and you won? So anyway, I don't know what he did about that, but it was, as my other commissioners have stated, a hard thing to watch, but, you know, that happens. We're more rules and regulations. They're political, and the system went as it was. And I will tell you, I brought it with me, the conditions put on this particular project is Now we have to rewrite the ordinance to include these, which is a good thing. Now we know where they're coming from, and that's the way the city standards will be after this. It's got to be an engineered structure, so it's not just somebody going out and building their own little teepee over the top of, whatever they are trying to keep the weather off of. They're going to have to address storm runoff issues. As we know, this particular structure went zero lot line and will actually throw water. I don't care. He said his property was engineered to the point where water runs, away from it. There's actually no way to prove that because nobody made him prove it. The setback requirements, and this is what bothers me the most, are going away little by little through the people that we've had here before, through variances and conditional use permits. We're going to zero lot lines. And, you can see it from the state. If the existing property owners don't want to develop, and they go through a couple of cycles here, we're going to get eventually forced into zero lot lines. And that's not why I came here. That's all Bay Area stuff. You can see what's happening in Tracy and what's happening in Livermore, and it's not pretty. They're looking like San Francisco on the hill, everything looks the same. So they are going to change the ordinance. I would suggest that if anybody on the commission here has any other requirements now that this is going through, that they'd like the staff to include in the rewrite or the addition to the ordinance, that you get them to Dominique. How soon do you need them?
We've got a lot of stuff going on November, December, so we probably won't be able to get into this till the new year, but we're going to try to get it done as soon as possible. That way it doesn't affect as many.
Will you give us a heads up?
Well, it's gonna be, most of them are
when you
gonna,
want those comments by, when you figure that out.
Thank you for coming.
thank you.
As to-
End of November. End of November would be great. It is Title 17, well, I should say, majority of the stuff that we would be making any updates and amendments to would be in Title 17, which would mean it needs to come to Planning Commission first. So you will be able to put your recommendations and comments on it that would be forwarded to the council.
Update by 11/19, okay.
But yeah, if you could do it by the end of November. Oh, and another note too, before I forget, is that we did receive confirmation to close City Hall the week of Christmas. So the offices will be closed December 23rd through the 27th, and it's been put in the newsletter, just to let you know.
Absolutely.
You done, Kurt?
I'm done with that issue. I'm going to let
Something
you.
else?
I just have a couple questions. So what's the status of Lear Village?
So he's currently forming his sidewalks, and is moving on his civil plans. He has those approved, so right now that's what he's been working on, is getting those sidewalks formed so he can pour them.
Okay, any idea when he's gonna do the building portion?
So Building A was approved, but it does require him to submit some plumbing plans that were not included, so we are waiting on a plumbing plan submittal. And then we're working on trying to obtain, he has to bond for the remainder of the work, and so he will not be able to bond for that until his sidewalks are in, because then it brings the amount to bond for down. So he is advising us that once those sidewalks are complete, he'll be able to get everything bonded, and then he'll bring in that information, and we can move forward with a final map and all these other things that are loose ends that can be tied up.
He's submitted permits for everything, for all the structures?
No, he's only submitted the permits for the Building A, which was the Phase 1. Yeah.
Will the other buildings be subject to the new building code amendments?
It's possible.
They're not permanent.
What?
They're not
If he
permanent.
doesn't apply for them by the end of the year, they would be allowed to be subject to that, yes.
What about the motorsports project at Boat Country?
So.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. They are moving forward with making some tentative improvements on the inside, or tenant improvements on the inside. They're trying to make like an entry hall area where people could sit down, a customer area, so nobody's in where they're actually doing the work. So they have pulled the permit to move forward with that. Regarding the outdoor improvements to the parking lot and such, they applied for their encroachment permit and things to be moved forward, but they have not come and picked it up or paid for it yet. So we're just waiting for that.
What's the expiration date?
February 15th?
Okay.
February 15th is when the 6 months are up. And we did collect a $5,000 deposit on the work.
Whatever happened with the club downtown that we talked about last year? Do you remember that?
Social
You're
club.
talking about the shop, yeah.
The shop.
I don't hear a lot about it. Every once in a while, I do hear that somebody rents it privately for a private party. But other than that, I haven't heard anything. We'll be sending out business license renewals, and so we'll see when the business license comes in, whether or not they're doing that.
Well, they did do the gate in the back, not the gate, the fence. And they did put the bocce ball court in, although it's not regulation, it fits as much as they can put in there with the crushed gravel and stuff. So there's that. Other than that, I don't know.
Well, and they've improved the inside, I've been inside that building.
And did the whole steel delivery and Chandler Enterprises get resolved?
Which?
The Chandler Enterprises and
Next to the lumberyard.
Yeah, so, are you talking about their concerns?
Yes.
Yes.
Remember
For the most part. So,
Mr. Israel showed up at the last planning commission meeting and we told him, great, but we really can't do anything.
yeah, so, the city had sent a letter out to the neighbors, of the lumberyard, advising them, that they had to have the lot cleaned up, and that they needed to have everything removed, all the steel removed. And they did meet that requirement. They do have one piece of steel out there that's been left out there to prevent trucks from going in there. We're working on
That was for.
trying to get that removed, I
I
guess.
was wondering what that was.
Yeah.
I think it's not even just trucks on the property, but probably parking. So,
They did install a sign because they were having trucks still parking there. And so they did put a, private property, no parking sign up. But we still see people parking there every once in a while, so.
Would that be a good place for a brewery? Make your wine.
Yeah, it would be.
I mean, yes, in the aspect that it could definitely go there. Parking might be an issue. I mean, they'd have to rely on the downtown parking, which we obviously have exemptions for that because of the lack of parking in that area. The only downside I could see is finding somebody that would want to build from the ground up. I mean, it's completely undeveloped. Nothing has been done on that property at all, which makes it much more difficult to bring somebody in that wants to put that much investment into something, so.
And who would improve Roosevelt Street? If something developed there, city?
So that's really hard because Roosevelt is very old, and so it's not as simple as giving it a slurry seal or a crack seal. It would need a
well,
complete
it's been
reconstruction.
abandoned as a street. It's
Oh,
not.
no, he
That
said
street?
Roosevelt.
No,
Oh,
Roosevelt.
Roosevelt, I'm so
Yeah.
sorry.
You're thinking Prospect.
I was
Yeah.
thinking Prospect,
That's the
yeah,
other one. That one I don't.
yeah,
We're done with that.
yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, that's come up and it's kind of difficult because you want somebody to come in and provide development and put something in there, but at the same time, I mean, it would be really difficult, I guess maybe depending on what they decide to put in there, to make them redo that entire road, so.
There would probably be some kind of level of contribution that we
Yeah.
could require, but
Level of
I
contribution,
don't know
sidewalks.
that we could make them do the whole road, but,
Well, I'm thinking that, looking down First Street, it's a lot more appealing now, looking at the lumberyard building. It's
Yeah.
starting to look.
Oh,
so-
yeah,
so-
yeah.
So there's some synergy going on in that area, you know.
There
so-
is, and,
and that could be a positive thing.
and Chandler Enterprises has a lot of, ideas for that area. They're actually, like, they've created a development plan for their property. And they know that when they're moving forward, things are gonna be putting in, you know, curb gutter, sidewalk, and those type of things. What we've been trying to do our best, on our end is they've actually had somebody draw up some development plans and kind of give us an idea of what they're looking to do on that property in the next so many years. And we're matching it with what we would end up doing with it when we move forward, or if we move forward with our First Street project that we've had a lot of discussion on, to make sure that he's not gonna be investing things into his property that we're gonna come through later on and rip them all out and redo them our way. And so we've been really working with him. Our staff and our engineers met out there with him several times, to go over things that he's planning on doing. I mean, recently, demolished a building that's out there, and he'll be rebuilding a new one, so he's replacing that building that was recently demolished. He has a couple other buildings he plans on taking down, a couple buildings that are gonna be added. So he's got a plan. So it's going to look very different.
It's looking much better.
Yeah.
We're still talking, what you're saying with the people, the trucking outfit. Is their development plan going to include a taxable business to the city?
Well, like they had mentioned, and they plan on dividing up those buildings into separate units so that other businesses could come in and operate out of them. That was something that they've received information.
We're talking
Need.
the lumberyard buildings.
Yeah, lumberyard
Oh,
buildings.
I'm in the
Oh, I'm
back.
sorry.
I'm in the back. I thought they had come through with some development plans, the trucking outfit.
No.
Oh, no, they, you're talking about for the other portion of the property, the vacant,
the-
undeveloped area.
Kurt, whatever his name is. I
Yeah,
don't know. I think it's
yeah, for that property, we had, a number of items that needed to be addressed in their submittal, and so we had sent them like a list of corrections or a request for additional information, to apply to that plan, and they've never resubmitted after that. And we did return the check to them as well, because it was quite a number of items to be looked at.
Yeah, I just think it's an inconsistent use in the city. First off, they can't use Roosevelt for that type of business that they were suggesting doing, and they shouldn't have been doing it with all the steel anyway. I just don't know if they have a different idea of some other type of businesses, or homes, or whatever they like to put in out there.
So the last thing we had heard from them, and they had talked to at council level, was that they had recently purchased one of the houses that was there, and they were going to turn it into their office, and they were
They
gonna
did.
do rentals and stuff like that. But they've never submitted back with that. We're not aware if they've turned it into an office.
Yeah, they were out there cleaning it up and
Yeah.
carpeting it and planting flowers along the fence, and
Yeah, I think they might be renting it out, but we're not
I don't know,
sure.
yeah.
And that was how it was previously used. It was a rental that somebody was living in, so.
My only other question is, did Mrs. Claire pull her permit for her pergola?
She did, yes.
Can't see it from Yosemite, so I don't know if it's been built yet or not, but
She did pull the permit. I believe she had an inspection last week. And the last thing I had heard was I think that she was foregoing the fireplace for now.
thank you.
You're welcome.
Years ago, I was in Dunedin, New Zealand. There's a brew pub called Bogies. And as you go in, they've got movie posters of Humphrey Bogart and whatnot. So I'm envisioning that here in Escalon. Nice, bistro tables, and you walk in, you see all the vats of the different colors of beer, and
Yeah, that would be really
It'll
nice.
be called Willis's.
Willis's,
Willis
that's a good
Pub.
name. Yeah.
D&B, or no, D&B, I guess.
Okay.
Any other question?
One of the things was in the housing plan here was discussion about the water, groundwater and well 1A. And I was over at P&L peering through the fence here the other day, and I didn't see anything going on. Is that?
There's not right now. We're waiting on our water rate study, for the state to authorize the funding. We have to prove to them that our water rates will support the funding, so,
I got
which
it.
our 5 years was up, so it was a good time to redo it.
Is there a minimum that you have to collect to apply, to get considered for a loan? Or is it just?
Well, your rates just have to show that there's the allocated funding built in the rates to cover the debt service on it.
I kind of touched on it earlier, but how come solar doesn't power a house?
Because, I'll tell you, because if you could put solar on your house, but if you're not charging a battery, you're not gonna have it during the times when you're not producing. So at night, when you're not producing, you're not gonna have electricity.
You have no sun.
Cause you have no sun.
But there's nothing that prevents you from putting in a system like that.
Correct.
Oh,
Except
okay.
the cost.
Yeah,
Right.
it's just the cost, yeah.
No, I get it, and I talk to
Maintenance.
people that have leased and purchased and all these other different things out there, but it says all I've heard is all you can do is sell it.
No,
You can't power your house.
You
so what
can't.
they do is PG&E also changes your rate to immediately when you go to solar, they kick you on to what's called a time of use
Yeah.
rate, and the rates are higher. So what happens is you generate all the power during the day, and the goal is to have it pencil out so that the power you produce while the sun is up offsets what you use at the night, so that it's supposed to come as a balance.
There's two two tiers. There's peak, and the peak is when everybody uses the
Primary
electricity.
use.
It's like,
3 to 9.
yeah.
Well, but in the morning, there's a peak too.
Yeah, it's, I wanna say 5 to 8 or something.
Yeah, something like
Yeah,
that.
so the kilowatt hours is really high then, and then before that and after that, it's lower. When the sun's up, it's generating power. Most people turn on lights at night unless you got a battery, and you can be off the grid. But if you do off the grid,
But it's battery, not
it's
solar.
it's battery.
And I had somebody recently mention that they were trying to get off the grid with PG&E, and they had a hard time, or it's difficult to do.
Well, it's.
You'll pay a departing load charge. Well, the city did, and from Bakersfield to the Oregon border is PG&E's territory. And you can be out in the boondocks with a generator powering your house, and you owe them a departing load charge, because they have an obligation to provide that facility power.
As long as
You have an obligation to pay for them to bring you that power and to connect it.
I don't think you can be completely off the grid.
Yeah, you can be if you're completely off the grid,
You can, but you're gonna owe the investment-owned utilities a departing load charge.
unless you were never connected in the first
Be
place.
the Unabomber.
If you power a residence, a building, anything in the state of California, you will owe a departing load charge.
I used to have some property
We
in a place called
went through that
Garberville.
with our development, with an MID development, because we get our power from MID. Public Utility Code Section 369 says the customers of that publicly owned utility have to pay a new municipal departing load charge to the investor-owned utility.
And I think that was partly because PG&E was required by CPUC to upgrade some of their equipment to be able to power certain areas. And that's always been my understanding of the departing loads, was because of the infrastructure that PG&E was required to put in. For the city, we pay departing load charges on our wastewater treatment plant because we chose to leave PG&E and go to MID. But we signed that agreement when we did that too.
So that
So
opens
ours
up,
was a little different than what the subdivision was.
so that opens up my last question for tonight, and that is, has there been any discussion internally within the city about, as a result of the recent blackouts? Obviously, we haven't been affected here yet. But-
I was.
Really? About possibly going to TID. Or, I'm sorry, not TID, MID,
You can't.
or,
So, I mean, we have certain facilities that are on MID. So 2 of our wells are on MID. Our McHenry Sewer Station is on MID. So we do have some of our, systems on MID. These buildings are MID.
could the entire city go to MID?
No.
Not at this time, no.
It would take an act of Congress, literally. There's a treaty that was signed in 1913 that delineates TID, MID, and others, I would assume. And they only get a certain amount of square miles that they can produce power outside their traditional water territories of irrigation. They can come across the Stanislaus River, and they came down McHenry at the request of the big canneries right here. So they brought MID down there, and when the developments, that was pretty much at the same time the developments for Westwood Country and Bellaterra were coming in, and MID went in and outbid them for the job, and it's been a huge contentious issue over, they stopped our, our protests against those departing load charges for 2 months over the term bona fide. What is a bona fide offer to a developer? They shut it down because they couldn't come up with a definition. It is so contentious, you can't believe. Well, in any event, I asked that question back in 2011, and I got a 3-page response. And it delineates the territory for MID, and there was like 1,000 acres left between Modesto, or MID and TID, because they're both somehow conjoined in this territory. And the remaining acreage is going to TID.
So what about OID?
They're not
They're not a power producer.
they don't have retail power.
I'm just, maybe it was you that brought it up, or you and I were talking about it last meeting, Tammy. But, the real concern is that for how many years, SSJID has been trying to help this, but now that PG&E is in bankruptcy, they're not gonna even, SSJID is not even gonna be.
So
in the mix.
SSJID has petitioned the bankruptcy courts for their takeover to be part of the bankruptcy. An interesting part would be that we did contact MID about when we were looking at First Street and doing the whole beautification of First Street. And we contacted them about the potential of them doing the undergrounding of utilities instead of us having to go through PG&E. And the representative with MID did kind of voice a little concern about, is this part of the territory that SSJID would be taking over, because they didn't want to step on SSJID toes. It wouldn't have penciled out for MID to do it, plus it wouldn't resolve the issue of the poles that are there, because PG&E would still have to be taking down those poles, and you would still have other utilities that you would have to work with. So it didn't really resolve the issue there, but I found it interesting that MID was concerned that this was the designated area for SSJID, and they didn't want to step on that.
I think the power situation in California is gonna get worse before it gets any better.
Oh, definitely. Definitely.
So, for those of you that are watching, please hammer them.
Any other comments?
Main Street House, where they were gonna subdevelop 3 other lots, and they just put up a fence, wood fence?
Oh, First
First
Street.
Street.
Yeah. Did I say Main Street?
Yeah.
No, First and Irwin.
I always do that, yeah.
Yes, so that applicant has informed us that he will no longer be moving forward with that map. He does intend to build a second house. At this point, he's putting up that fencing for now because he just can't keep people from staying off of his property. He's got people walking their dogs through there, he's got kids playing in there. And so it's been of a concern to him. Doesn't everybody know that I own this property? They don't, because it sat vacant for so long. Everybody got used to walking through there and stuff.
I thought he was shielding the weeds, so he didn't have to take
No,
out.
no, he's actually been pretty good at keeping those down. And so they went ahead and moved forward with building that fence, and he's actually on the November agenda for a use permit and a variance, moving forward on a project. And at this point, yeah, the fencing will go around, but then he's gonna go back on one side and push that fencing back or remove a portion of it later on and when he moves forward with his project.
So he's gonna put one of the two houses in that he wanted to do, or?
Well, actually, he's coming next month, applying for a use permit and a variance, I believe, on it might just be a use permit on a garage. He's gonna build a garage for that house.
And the shop too, right?
Garage workshop, yes.
After he tears down the other?
It
Well,
sounds like
currently,
he's
he's
not gonna
building the fencing right now. He's gonna keep that house on the center.
Yeah.
He's building the workshop garage to go with that house, and then later on in the future, he plans on putting a second house on the lot.
But that garage was gonna have to come down for that
That
one
garage will be
house.
demoed,
Okay.
yes. Yeah, that one
Part
is
of this
still
project?
that one was part of the original project, that it has to be demoed, and he knows that will still have to come down, so.
Concurrently with his submittal for a conditional use permit?
We would probably end up, and we just got his application in last week, and so we haven't put the conditions down, but in review of that, we'll review his last use permit.
Yeah.
And require that be removed, which he knows it still needs to be removed.
Well,
But
know-
yeah, we'll
knowing
condition
and
to make
doing, you
sure.
know.
No, I know, yeah, but it will definitely be conditioned to still remove the one that's existing, yeah.
The residential care home, Six got pushed back because of funding and what have you to 2021. And we have seen some kind of plans years ago on that. Do they know that there will be additional building code requirements going forward?
Yes, well, they don't know that it updates every 3 years, but that's the hiccup they ran into this last cycle and why they had to come back to Planning Commission, because all of their approvals had expired. They're good for a certain amount of years, your use permit, and if you're not pulling the permit at that point, and so they had to come back. They also had to go back on their 2013 plans and have them updated to 2016 code, which they had done, and got approved, so those are currently approved. But yes, at some point, if they do want to move forward, we would have to tell them that they'll need to resubmit their plans to 2019 code.
I don't know, but in lieu fees are only for residential uses,
In lieu fees are for residential uses, yeah.
and that's not considered a residential use?
It's considered multifamily, but I think because of the use of it being for through a program and through the Covenant Church, it's been labeled under institutional because it's providing a service, and so that's how the in lieu fee doesn't apply.
It's too bad we can't help them out, with that.
Which, yeah, we had tried to with some of our CDBG funds.
Yeah, we did
I-
give
I-
them that money.
Yeah.
I got that, but, they could get a chunk.
They need much, much, much more.
How much are they short, did they say?
I don't know for sure, but from what they had indicated to staff, they had lost a very large portion of the project. Like, they had somebody that was contributing a lot more than other people, and they backed out. And I'm not sure why, maybe because the project is kind of
Stalling.
delayed, and you can only wait so long, or something like that. But they were looking at trying to find another project, and I don't believe they ever received the additional federal funding that they were looking for as well.
It's too bad.
Yeah,
That's a good
Yeah, because
project.
they were using some of our funding for the match for that federal, right?
Didn't they apply for a grant and then the timing ran out and then they had to reapply? and-
Yeah, that was for their federal funding that they were trying to obtain, yeah. And they were trying to move forward on that, but I think at some point they were getting their application ready and moving forward with that, but then they lost their sole grant, like a private
They
donation.
lost their soul.
That's what I was. Oh, boy, they're really out of luck.
Their primary donation, yeah, so.
Yeah.
And they had actually already gone through, you know, basically 100% of their environmental review. And so they're going to pay for that out of pocket, so that they don't use the CDBG. So they're gonna be covering that portion since they had already moved forward and were 99% done before they let us know. So,
Last thing, and I don't want to ruin your voice here, but I talked to Justin, I don't know, a month ago. He said that the new pump station isn't online because they were dickering with the railroad over distance.
Yeah, so that was a combination. So initially, a holdup was because the railroad was pressing us to get the encroachment permit. Everything is ready to go. We have a final tie-in to actually convert from, tie-in from the old station to the new station. And so I actually had our city attorney send a letter to the railroad that said, look, this is a health and safety issue. We're not gonna wait anymore. Well, unfortunately, now the contractor and the electrical contractor are on other jobs, so we're waiting on them to be able to come back. In the meantime, we still haven't gotten the encroachment permit from the railroad, who said it was supposed to be like 90 to 120 days, and I think we're either at 120 or beyond the 120 now.
So would you take that as an acceptance?
Well, we've pretty much, I've told our contractor and my engineers that we don't wait for their encroachment permit. We're moving on this.
Yeah.
Because as it is already, we could have been connected a month ago. But because we had to let the contractor go, now it's held us up. And, you know, I mean, that lift station is being replaced truly for a reason.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be stuck in a position where it's an emergency. So,
We're gonna send the railroad a bill for all of the work that we still have to
apply
do.
for damages.
yeah.
You know?
Yeah, so, I believe that November time is what the goal is on that.
We're shooting for end of November, yeah.
Yeah.
Enough of me.
Thanks for the treats.
Any other comments?
Good luck to our fellow commissioner, our chair, Commissioner Sarkozy, dealing with our friends at PG&E tonight.
Oh, is that where he is?
Ugh.
All right. Well, wish everybody a safe Halloween.
Yes.
Thank you for the tree.
We'll be back before then.
And meeting adjourned.
Thank you.